let's conscious of time. Let us kick off. So welcome everybody. So this is our third in our series of what we called our In Conversation events, where I get the privilege really of interviewing some of the key players in the energy transition and kind of CP, Clean Power 2030 kind of mission. So Regen, as most of you will know, our kind of focus in life, our mission is the energy transition, is accelerating that transition to a net zero energy system. This is what we're really interested to do, I guess, in these sessions, is to get a bit beyond some of the kind of ambitions and headlines and into some of the key kind of crunchy decisions that we need to make, we need to work through if we're going to create the framework to enable this kind of scale of transition that we're all aiming for to deliver. So I've already had sessions with Chris Stark from DESNZ Mission Control and with Finton from NISO. And so today, delighted to have be joined by Akshay Kaul from Ofgem, the third leg of the stool. Is that welcome, Akshay. We'll give you a chance to introduce yourself in just a moment. But just for all our attendees, just in terms of how this session will run. So I'm going to do a quick bit of intros. Then I was going to probably inevitably talk about connections reform. We hopefully segue from that a bit into kind of network regulation. Obviously, that's a key area for Ofgem. Move on to market reform, national pricing, etc. And hopefully we might have a chance at the end to touch on local power. So that's the kind of agenda. In terms of inputting, you can feel free to use the chat function. I think that's all enabled. I think one of the good things about the online format, probably has some downsides, but is that you can sort of have a sort of side event going along with chat and share ideas and thoughts and things. So feel free to do that. And then if you do want to chuck in a question, then Q&A, please also feel free to do that. And I think you can upvote in the usual way. I'll try and keep an eye on that and see where we have opportunities to kind of work those into the session. And we hopefully will save a little bit of time at the end to take a couple of general questions as well. But I'll try and weave them in where they come into the kind of narrative as I can. Okay, that's enough of the intro. Let's kick on. So firstly, Akshay, most people probably know you for your stirring forwards to Ofgem policy documents that otherwise, when you look at the title and length, you think might be quite boring, but you'll do a great job at those couple of pages at the front that tell us how exciting, the important the issues are, rightly, I think. So maybe if you just tell us a little bit more about your role at Ofgem, firstly.
Yes, of course. Well, and may I just start by thanking you and the Regen team, for this opportunity to come along and talk, but also a wider thank you for the work that Regen has been doing in this energy space. I think it has been absolutely magnificent, not just in terms of the thought leadership from people like Johnny, has been really, really great, but the very practical support that you guys have given the industry, convening the industry, getting them together, helping us to progress in a lot of ways, the progressive reforms that we need to see in the sector. So I just wanted to start by saying a very, very big thank you.
Thank you, Akshay. The next point's on me, and those words will be up on our website tomorrow.
All right, so a little bit about me. So I'm the Director General for Infrastructure at Ofgem, and I cover all the work that we do on network regulation, wholesale markets, and cybersecurity. And my background is largely in infrastructure and energy. So I started out in banking. I worked in project finance. I then joined the Treasury and spent 10 years working with the Private Finance Initiative under the Blair and Brown governments. Then spent the next 5 years on energy policy, including on, of course, electricity market reform, where I worked from the Treasury side on setting up the contract for difference auctions and the capacity auctions that are such a core part of the market today. A couple of years in Transport for London, we're trying to raise money for some of our London capital projects. And then since about 2017, I've been in Ofgem. And I think it is definitely, without question, the best time to work in the energy sector. Certainly in
Yep.
regulation, I can say that with confidence. It is the most interesting set of problems in a generation, and they're all really interesting to solve, but they're also very impactful if we collectively solve them well. But even if you're, working in other parts of the space, energy policy, I think, has never been this interesting. Delivery, is so fantastically interesting. I think if you work in the network companies, they're fully charged up, with the
Mm.
delivery challenge that they have ahead of them, whether it's at the transmission or distribution level, and obviously colleagues in the NISO as well, fully charged with a fantastic new mission that they've got to sort of plan the system and then operate it in this most intelligent way possible. So I think it's a really, really great time to be in energy and in regulation.
Right. Can I just again setting the scene? I talked about the three-legged stool of the kind of policymaker, regulator, system operator. I don't know if we have a collective noun yet. The triumvirate, maybe the trilemma, possibly. But I guess that there has been some challenge, I guess, in the kind of in the industry around the clarity of the roles and responsibilities. I wonder how you visualize the kind of the role of the regulator as it intersects with those other two bodies.
I was going to say triads, but I thought it might be misunderstood.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it's there's definitely a really good question to ask about institutional roles and responsibilities, which I would say are evolving as we go through, but in my view, evolving in a really helpful and very positive way. So for the longest time, we had the Department for Energy setting energy policy. Rightly,
Yep.
ministers should set the energy policy framework within which regulation occurs, including things like setting carbon targets, setting security of supply targets, determining affordability constraints, thinking about what support consumers should get, who should get that support. Ofgem has classically been the rule maker, and particularly the economic regulators. We set prices and we set quality of service standards for the monopoly networks that we regulate, and we also license a lot of the wholesale market and ensure that they comply with the rules for running a fair and open competitive market in energy. But what we have been missing ever since electricity market reform led to the much more assertive role for government in terms of determining the quantum of investment and the nature of investment in the sector through the CFD and capacity auctions. What we've been missing was a coherent system architect or system planner that could ensure that all of the various parts of the sector, particularly generation and transmission, but I would say increasingly also demand and storage, but certainly generation and transmission, were properly coordinated. And I think that if you look back at the 2010 to 2020 decade, to me, the hallmark of that decade is the eye-watering rise in congestion and constraint costs, that we saw, which are largely, I mean, I would date them back to the connect and manage policy coming in 2010. We're starting to connect a lot of renewable generation up in Scotland. The network is not particularly well synchronized with that. It starts to fall behind, and you get a very predictable result in terms of pushing up congestion. So we were really missing a proper system planner. And I'm really, really pleased that we have created that in the form of the NISO. Okay. And it needed to be a public entity, because I think otherwise there would be a pretty clear perceived or actual conflict of interest if the system planner was essentially sitting inside a network utility that had a financial interest in network expansion. So we just wanted to make sure that it is fulfilling that role squarely on behalf of the public sector. And I'm really, really pleased that we now have this triumvirate, as you say.
Okay. Thank you. Let's think about a bit of a way then. Talk first about connections reform, probably inevitably, and also just context your last answer. It's an example, I guess, where we've had NISO leading a process and Ofgem having a key role as the regulator, signing off code modifications, on providing steering, governance, etc. So we've, it's been a long process. It's been quite a challenging process at times, and we're still kind of very much in the midst of making it work. But just before we dive into some of the kind of detail, I'm interested in, from Ofgem's perspective, what kind of success looks like. What are the sunlit uplands once we've gone through the trenches of getting this big reform, which arguably the most significant far-reaching reform of everything that's going on around trying to enable CP30.
It is. It is. I think connections reform. I think previously I've called it, something that is unpleasant but is absolutely necessary. It has to be done, and we have tried, Merlin, again with your support and the wider industry support, to take more conservative measures first to see if that would fix the problem, and they didn't. So I think now the reform that we're carrying out, essentially to reorder the entire connections queue and put in place a queue that is both ready, so the projects are ready to go, and they're needed. They're the projects that are needed to run a safe and secure system for 2030. I think is absolutely vital to enable Clean Power 2030 as a program. And I'm very conscious that we're doing it at some pace, because Clean Power 2030, the target is only 5 years away. So we have to make sure that people get their connection offers as quickly as possible, and we get those waiting times down, right down to a level that is efficient and consistent with the overall program deadline. I think, again, the effort has been fantastic. I mean, again, I just want to say a big thank you to colleagues in NISO, the industry, you guys. I know, Merlin, you've personally been committed and been leading a lot of the connections delivery group and a lot of the conversations in the industry. I think it's been a fantastic collaborative effort to get the basic reform package set out. We're now in the implementation phase. And again, I'm conscious things have not always gone exactly as planned. We've had issues with the portal. Again, we've been working very closely with colleagues in the NISO, encouraging them to make sure that everybody has a chance to submit their information, which they have now. So the portal's closed. Everybody's had a chance to put in their information. We're now going through the process of processing that information into new queue. And again, the encouragement from our side has been to do this once and do it right. So even if it takes a little bit longer, it's very important that there is a transparent, consistent, fair process, rigorous process that is, that is essentially clearly explainable to everybody on the other side once we get to the other side. And so I think the latest timetable is up there now.
Yep.
I think what we're expecting essentially is that we'll do NISO will carry out the detailed checks and the processing of the information until November. We're expecting the first week of December to start to get notifications of the type of offer that people can expect, whether they're Gate 1 or Gate 2. January 2026, the transmission connected projects that are commissioning in 26, 27 should get their connections dates. End of the first quarter, March of 2026, the distribution projects that are in the 2026, 27 timeline should get their connection offers. And then by the end of June 2026, we should get all the Gate 2 offers for 2030 out there. And then by the end of September, all of the Gate 2 offers, even beyond 2030, should be out there. So I know that this is a bit longer than the original timetable, but it is what we think is necessary to do this right and do it once.
Okay. Just a couple of more specific issues about that time, because you say, it makes a lot of sense to get it right, but the delays do have some implications, and some of these points might be ones just for us to kind of discuss and perhaps take away. But I think one of the things I'm hearing from industry is one of the changes, and I think Ofgem were quite strong on this, into the connection methodologies, was to introduce quite clear protections for anyone, maybe people due to build in 26, 27, already got planning, ready to go. I think the industry at the moment is perhaps feeling that those protections are no longer very protective. Because if they are still vulnerable, if I could put it that way, their position in the queue is protected. If the TO is unable to deliver that physically, they may still find there are delays. So at this point, they need to move on with making financial decisions, committing to supply. If they're going to meet their milestones, if they don't meet their milestones, they risk their project. They have to make commitments. But they don't really have total confidence in their connection date at the other side. So the intent of that process to give people protection so that we didn't slow people down, they could just get on with it, is I think something that people are now finding challenging. So I wonder if there's anything we can all do to try and give back that sense of confidence to enable people, to do what they want to do, which is to get on building. That's what all the industry is about, isn't it? It wants to get on and build stuff, and they're all kind of slightly feeling like they're holding. So any thoughts on that particular issue for near-term projects?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to where developers are at the moment. In an ideal world, we would just do this, immediately, and everybody would get their connection offers, and there would be
Mhm.
none of this kind of in limbo period where
Mhm.
you're just waiting to get your connection offer and your date confirmed. And as you say, Merlin, we have created in the process a kind of prioritization.
Mhm.
So the near-term projects will hear the most quickly because we don't want them to be delayed. And then we'll get to the 2030 projects, which are sort of near to medium term. And then we'll get to the post 2030 projects, which are sort of medium to long
Mhm.
term. So we are trying to get people certainty as soon as we possibly can. If there's anything else that can be done in terms of reassurance or confidence, then we are all ears. But at the moment, the full focus, and I know NISA colleagues are
Mhm.
fully focused on getting this right and doing it as quickly as possible, but also doing it as rigorously as possible.
Okay, well, that we might come back to next, say 3 months, where people are, if you're let's say you're trying to got a connection date in a year's time, you have to place your order. But if you're going to get that date, but you're not going to get your offer for another 3 months, that puts you in a pretty difficult position. And if NISO is then going to enforce the milestones, you're a bit caught. So I feel that there is perhaps something there that we can all do to achieve the intent of the protections in practice. But we'll follow up on that. And I guess a similar issue there in terms of timescales is just recognizing that if we think of 2028 projects, for example, at the moment, I think if you're at transmission, you would get your end of Q2 26. I think you'd get your offer.
Correct.
It's
Yeah.
probably, I don't know, if you're building a big transmission connected project, it's probably at least 3 years from getting your get to offer to actually energization once you've gone through various processes and building, etc. I'm thinking of maybe a battery project or something here. Obviously, some different things for different timelines, which takes you well into 2029. So that I guess highlighting that the industry is sitting there looking, is getting these timelines, looking at all the things they have to deliver against, and feeling there's some definite challenges and tensions with that. So I think that's something we just need to all understand. And as we, anything, I suppose the main message is anything you guys can do to encourage and support NISO to deliver ahead of the timeline, given that they said up to, would be super valuable. And I think there needs to be a sort of understanding and recognition of some of the impacts on timelines for developers as they think about their milestones, etc.
Yeah, no, I've heard that loud and clear, Merlin. Absolutely take it on board. We will encourage the NISO and give them every support to accelerate wherever we can. So ideally, we come in ahead of these timelines. But I'm just very conscious that the primary aim is to just make sure we get this right the first time we do it. I think that's going to be our overriding objective.
Okay, good stuff. And probably the other thing to say from the industry point of view is that they're very, collaborative. They want to work with NISO and Ofgem, and to encourage any opportunities to kind of set up panels to check things, but provide the enormous expertise in industry to help, basically. And I feel like as we've gone into the implementation stage, and I can understand why, we've perhaps moved a bit away from the slightly more collaborative approach we had when we were designing the methodology. And you can see why, because you want to do it fairly and not. But I think there are ways of bringing in industry expertise into this process, and so I think that again, that's just encourage all parties designing this process to think about that and to kind of try and make the most of that. Okay, just any I mean, maybe this is a little bit early, but from your point of view, any kind of lessons from this is working together with as we go through other reforms and SSEP and to NUOS and LDs about working where we're having to put some hard work into driving key reforms through, and how to make these processes effective and smooth as possible.
Yeah, and I think the single biggest lesson from the connections reform so far is, as you said, the value of transparency, engagement, collaboration. So people understand what is being done, why is it being done. We have a chance to test things before we put them out in the field. And there is a kind of open culture where everybody's sort of, no one's looking to blame anybody else. We're all trying to get to the objective together. And so the orientation is entirely a solution orientation, to say, how do we fix this? How do we make progress? How do we move forward?
Okay.
And I think that to me is the spirit with which we should approach, the next set of exercises, as you say, as well, in terms of spatial planning and the network planning that is going to come in the next couple of years.
Okay. Just glancing at the questions as we went in, there was a specific one, which I don't think we yet have a date for the first enduring window. Obviously, people with pipelines trying to bring forward projects, they'd like to know that so they can sort of plan things. So I don't suppose you can announce that for me live on air, but it's
no. I mean, originally we were hoping that would come in at the end of this year, but that is not going to happen now with the timetable that we have. So we're going to try and make sure the first enduring window opens as quickly as possible in 2026.
Okay. I won't push you any further, as quickly as possible. What that means. Okay. Yeah. The final element of this I was going to talk about and lead us into kind of how you regulate networks side of this is the end-to-end review. So I've always seen that as the kind of yin to the yang of connections reform, and connections reform is all about developers having to hit milestones, developers having to reapply for connections, developers having to, jump through a whole load of hoops. All well and good, but obviously it's important that their counterparty, the network who's actually connecting them, also has is also incentivized to meet its responsibilities in those contracts. And the end-to-end review is perhaps, most of the focus has been on the yin rather than the yang so far. So I'm wondering how are we getting on with the end-to-end review?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think we're going to be opening that consultation pretty soon. And in fact, we were just discussing it this afternoon at our policy committee. As you say, it's the second half or it's the mirror image, if you like, the yin and the yang of connections reform. We're putting the developers and the customers of the grid through quite a lot in terms of readiness criteria and financial commitments and so on. And I think it's really, really important that we encourage the networks to be ambitious, of course, in terms of their ability to connect people quickly, but also be reliable. So when they commit to a date, then the customer should expect them to meet that date, and otherwise there should be some consequences. There should be some compensation. And broadly, the way we're thinking about this is to put in place a kind of macro level incentive to encourage and reward ambition from the network so that they are pushing and accelerating as quickly as they can. And then a micro level, customer level standard of performance where if the date is not met, then there is some automatic compensation back to the customer. I think the calibration of this, I think, has to be done quite carefully in terms of the levels of exposure, the levels of risk on the networks. And we also want to make sure that this mechanism to ensure that there's accountability and there are consequences for missing dates does not lead to a risk aversion in the setting of the dates. We actually don't want to see an expansion in the timescales. We want to see an acceleration in the timescales, but then be reliable, in the dates that are being committed to. So I think that's the sort of broad makeup of the effort there. Okay. And within the next couple of weeks, we should be out with the consultation on.
So we've had one consultation, which was more of a kind of call for evidence, and this is now a sort of minded to kind of
setting our proposals,
white paper setting. Okay, excellent. And I guess one way that perhaps does take us into network regulation, obviously a key role for Ofgem, and that's one mechanism you can use to drive some of those standards. So was having a chat, your request with Steve the other day about the price controls for the transmission operators 2027. I'm wondering if, I think when I look at the numbers under connections delivery, the dashboard that gets published and the amount that's being connected at the moment, it tends to be around 0.5 gig a month. And if you think about CP30 numbers, you're very back of an envelope, you're talking about 3 times that activity. So you're talking about networks connecting 3 times as much as they have been traditionally, which is obviously a massive step up in terms of work, and that's a massive challenge for them. And obviously incentives help. Is there, do you see within the TO price control some clear incentives for them for networks to deliver all these connections offers that we'll be getting out?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying. So I think we want to put in place both a macro level incentive, a connections
Okay.
incentive in the T3 control,
Yeah.
which rewards, innovative, ambitious delivery of connection offers, and then a kind of micro level, customer level arrangement
Okay.
where if you're a customer, you've been given a date and the network doesn't adhere to that date, there are some consequences and some compensation that flows from that. So that's the sort of broad arrangement. And then again, we want to we do that same thing for the distribution network operators. The ED3 control is just coming at a 2-year stagger, come 2 years later, but a very similar idea to have a really powerful incentive to encourage ambition in terms of acceleration, and then some accountability mechanisms at the customer level to ensure reliability.
Okay. So that gives us an insight into how you might be using your powers to try and encourage the networks to, in a way, they're moving from the process that we're going through to the actual physical, it's all very well having a great process and lots of plans, but it's actually about kit in the ground, isn't it? And electrons flowing. So using those price controls. Okay, let's just move on a little bit about that. You've brought up the DNO price control, and the yesterday we saw the sector specific methodology consultation. Is that right? With more, as I say, particularly ringing front words from yourself with the nothing, not a moment to lose kind of thing. I heard slightly the rhythm of almost at the end of the Communist Manifesto. I felt there's workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Networks of the world.
Carthago delenda est is another phrase you could use there.
I don't know if that's a recognized phrase, but there is, I think, in those price controls quite a significant shift to me in approach. I had a quote of Iridico. We want a more proactive, strategically planned approach to long-term network investment. Do you see that as a significant change from a more traditional, kind of you bring me a project, I give you a price?
Yeah, and I really liked your summary of it, because that's exactly the nature of the change. We're moving from a kind of bottom-up DNO-led process where we look at each of the plans in isolation, and then we approve some projects at the front, and then projects come one by one through various types of reopeners, uncertainty mechanisms, so on. We're moving from that kind of way of working to something that is much more strategically planned through engagement with the regional local authorities in each area, businesses in each of the areas, consumer groups, to have a much better grounding for a planned expansion of the distribution grid, so that we can essentially put a lot more stuff in the baseline. And then, obviously, you can never get predictions perfect, so there will always be a need for whatever baseline we set to flex to a range of different demand circumstances. But that baseline will be much, much better informed by the demands that are going to be placed on the distribution grid, both on the demand and the supply side. So local generation as well as local demand, housing, data centers, that sort of thing. So I think I'm pretty excited about this, because again, it's not that the DNOs haven't been doing a lot of it. I mean, they do fantastic engagement with local authorities, but this is a much, much more integrated system, which integrates the national level planning through the Spatial Strategic Energy Plan, with the local and the regional level planning that is more bottom up with local authorities and so on, and hopefully makes sure that interface between transmission and distribution is well managed.
Okay. So we have just kind of thinking about how that change of approach might be felt on the ground. We've been talking about connections. Would you envisage then that there are rules about connecting and you have to pay costs that you create, but you might expect, if there's more strategic planning, that you end up with lower connection charges because the network is kind of ready for it's expecting that level of development of, say, let's take generation in that area, and therefore it's planned, and therefore your costs are more like your sole use costs rather than sort of triggering upgrades. With that, Is that where we're heading? Do you feel? I hope.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, depends on the scale of the strategic investment, of course. But yes, I mean, that would be the natural consequence of doing a lot more planned investment in upgrading the grids, which is essentially socialized across consumers.
Yeah.
And that should mean when an individual customer comes along to connect, it's both quicker and cheaper to connect them to the grid.
Okay. So we talked there about the approach to network investment and to the build. There's also a lot of interest out in the world around flex these days. We know we need a lot of flex to clean power 2030 and keep the system costs efficient. So there's a phrase in there where you say you particularly want networks to build, but we also want them to flex. But specifically, you no longer want them to use flex to delay network investment. If they need to invest, they need to get on with it. But you do see a role with flex. Maybe you can just say a little bit more about the kind of use cases and tools you might see for DNOs in this new world of how they're using flexibility.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think the words get very easily misinterpreted in the distribution context. I think we had said in the last round of price controls that we would take a flexibility first approach.
Mm-hmm.
And that was interpreted as saying, don't reinforce the network, use flexibility first and keep using flexibility and only reinforce the network as a last resort. That was one interpretation of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't really the point of it. The point of it was to sort of maximize the use of flexibility to optimize the scale and the timing of network investment needed. But I think if we're moving now into a more planned setup, as I was saying, what we should expect is that there will be a much better baseline program in the ED3 controls, which will accommodate a planned expansion of the network, and that will be just programmed in. And then there'll be a need to flex around that as the circumstances change. You can never get demand forecasts exactly right. There may be more people to connect than you expected. There may be more local generation on the system than you expected. And I think accommodating that and optimizing, therefore, the rollout of the grid capacities is the big role that I think Flex can play in helping the DNOs to optimize their upgrade programs and flexing to whatever demands are placed on them during the control period without delaying people. So either without delaying people or connecting them, but then curtailing people most of the time. I think that's where Flex can play a very, very important role. The other area where Flex, I think, can play an important role is in helping to manage the network constraints over time on the grid on a sort of time of use basis. And I think we are starting to see the DNOs making pretty, clever, innovative, creative use of flexibility through aggregators and suppliers to, again, manage the constraints in a more intelligent way. So I think those use cases are still very, very powerful. But they are not the reason to say that don't reinforce the network. That's that. We just wanted to be clear about that there is a big expansion in demand coming. We need to prepare for that. Let's put that into the baseline, get on with it. Mm-hmm. But still, a lot of flex and optimization will be needed to accommodate.
Okay. On the generation side, I noticed that perhaps I know some of the DNOs have been doing this, but perhaps it hasn't been entirely clear that they can. That the ability to use demand turn up, which could allow. So that could allow you to reduce the amount of curtailment of generation.
Correct.
And it could potentially allow you to enable more to connect, possibly as well, if you have that tool to kind of manage the risk. Just as currently, DNOs can essentially do that without any cost. So they put generators on active network management, and then they don't need, if they've got too much power, they just turn them off and there's no compensation. So I'm just interested in how that sort of plays out kind of financially. Are they able to spend the money on demand to encourage people to turn up demand in order to enable all these generators to keep generating more, even though they could actually just turn them off for free?
Yeah, I think that is a good point, because that's a difference, isn't it, between the distribution and the transmission grid. On the transmission grid, we have a compensation regime. And so demand turn up has a clear benefits case. If you avoid the compensation, you can put that money into paying demand turn up. And the same financial incentive doesn't exist necessarily at the distribution grid level. So I think we'll have
Yep.
to look at the incentive design to create something like that, so that you are getting, because in a sense the curtailment is still a cost to society, even if it isn't a cost to the network. So we have to
Yep.
recognize that, and then that incentive should hopefully make the demand turn up possibilities feasible for DNOs.
Okay. And just briefly on the demand side of using flex, and this is getting in a little bit into some of the detail, but when we look at the kind of construction planning assumptions that NESO use in the RESP for EVs and heat pumps, they do actually, we're probably a bit geeky on this area because we did the work with the National Infrastructure Commission and their distribution report, and we did a lot of the analysis. They do actually assume that when you look at the kind of load that they're assuming EVs and heat pumps put on the network, it appears there's quite a lot of smart charging, et cetera, built into those assumptions. So we are assuming quite a lot of kind of smart, and so that will lead presumably to a lower network build than if we assumed other things. So we are relying on that. Do you feel comfortable, I guess, with that? Is there a risk there that smart charging, smart use of EVs, of heat pumps, the ability to shift doesn't happen in quite the way we're hoping? Doesn't, on a really cold winter, we end up with people using, unable to flex anymore and just having to heat their homes and the like.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly for 2030, the bigger play is on EVs, accommodating the EV demand with smart charging. They come with smart charging defaults, and I think that is why we feel reasonably confident that there will be, most people will use charging on a smart basis, at least while you're still using, home charging, that there's a very strong case for doing you can already see that, if you look at the difference in charging rates, if you charge overnight versus if you charge during the day, the financial incentive is quite powerful.
Yeah, very much.
And so I think we feel quite confident that people should respond to that. But you're right, Merlin. I mean, this market has a history of people not always engaging in the way that you would expect, rational economic actors in models to engage. And I think we should keep an eye on that.
Okay. Yeah.
The government is doing everything, Ofgem is doing everything, NESO is doing everything to make sure that, and the suppliers, of course, are preparing for this, including with the rollout of half-hourly settlement coming, to make sure that smart charging is the default choice for most people.
Okay, great. And we might come back to this in terms of the charging allocation question, which I know you guys have been looking for input into. Okay, I've dived down into some detail. There's geeky detail that Regen's particularly interested in, but let's just broaden back up into the kind of market reform agenda. We're now into a reform national markets world. I don't know if that's the end of REMA and a new thing, or if it's another phase of REMA. Quite how it's seen. Obviously, there was a lot of debate there, and we won't go into outcomes and what Ofgem's views were, etc. But we've got a good decision. We're all into reformed national markets, and there are some obvious areas to perhaps touch base with you on there, like TNUOS. But I just wonder what you see as the main elements of what market reform now looks like in the kind of government's decision.
Yeah, thanks, Melly. I mean, and obviously you guys at Regen have been a very big part of this debate over the last few years. And I imagine you were quite supportive of the government's decision in progressing.
We did welcome it, yes.
Yeah, you did welcome it. So there are three main aspects to that Reform National Market program now. There's the spatial energy plan itself, to get that delivered on time and make sure that it informs the centralized network plan that follows. So essentially get the coordination right between generation and transmission. There's the transmission charging reform, which then sends signals to the various market participants to locate their projects in line with the creation of the grid capacity, which is itself in line with the spatial energy plan, so that we make good use of the grid capacity that we're creating. And then there's the question of the operation of the grid, where we want to find the most effective way of managing constraints on the grid while we are waiting for the grid upgrade to take
Okay.
place. And I think there's an understanding that the constraints are going to stay elevated because the grid is still catching up through the rest of this decade, probably the early part of the next decade. And so constraint costs are going to stay quite elevated and then come down in the sort of mid 2030s. So we want to try and put as much downward pressure as possible on those constraint costs by balancing the system in the most intelligent way. So those are the three main parts of it: the spatial plan, the transmission charge reform, and the balancing reform.
Okay, let's just cover those, talk about those three a little bit more then. So we've got, we've now, as you've pointed out, strategic spatial energy plan. So that's a big change, isn't it? We'll have there's going to be a plan. We didn't have a plan before, and now there's a plan. This is how much we need. This is where it goes. I wonder, there has been some concern in the industry, and this is perhaps going back to our earlier discussion about connections reform, and this is a NESO thing, not your direct responsibility, but you're obviously regulating them, about the level of transparency on the kind of modeling assumptions, data, etc., that's going into the plan. Feeling of that you're kind of that stakeholder engagement is a bit like a sort of flickering light reflection of what's going on in the campfire, and you're trying to deduce what assumptions might be going in. I can see that there's some, I can see some challenges, and some of that data might be, some of the assumptions might be coming from, commercial, protected sources or subject to data confidentiality, etc. But in the end, this sort of plan is not only a NESO or DESNZ and Ofgem plan, is it? It's got to be a whole industry plan, because the industry are the people going to have to put in hundreds of millions to make the plan actually happen, and it's got to be deliverable and investable, to put it in other terminology. I wonder if you think there's a sort of lessons there that we could try and find ways of opening up the details of the process so that everyone, including the industry, can input into all the assumptions.
Yeah, that's good feedback, and I'm certainly happy to take that back to the department and the NESO. They're the two key bodies that are driving the creation of the spatial energy plan. And obviously the department needs to supply the kind of policy inputs into that plan, and then the system operator can do a lot of the system modeling. But I share your encouragement in making that as collaborative, as open, as transparent as possible. Obviously the plan itself, is meant to be the bedrock of decisions taken across the energy system later on, and it will need to go through a sort of community impact assessment, the strategic environmental appraisal, all of those things, because the aim was that it should be enshrined in some way in the sort of planning system as the spatial plan that everybody refers to. So absolutely, it will be quite open and it will be quite transparent. But while it is being developed, I know already at the methodology stage, NESO colleagues did a lot of work with the industry to open up their method papers, their working papers, and so on. There's some modeling work at the moment going on, which I think probably needs to just play out until there's a bit of shape and certainty to the numbers, and then I imagine that there will be a fair amount of open collaboration and engagement. But I will certainly take the message back to the department and the NESO on that.
Because in the end, the plan, obviously, if you've got a certain number of how much we need or something, onshore wind in Scotland, that has real world consequences for people's development pipelines.
Of course.
In the end, Secretary of State makes decisions, and that's understood. But I think everyone would want to understand, exactly how did we get to the boundary constraint at the B6 in 2031.
And remember the plan, Merlin, it's been commissioned not just by the Westminster government, if you like, but it's been commissioned by all the three countries together. So I think it absolutely will need to be fully transparent in that respect.
You then talked about TNUoS, and obviously this is another critical issue for generators and reform, and you put out a paper a little while ago, kind of with some options. Just, I guess, one point, if you like, of philosophy. If we have a plan and we said this is how much we want there and this is how much we want there, what is the role of a locational signal from a market signal alongside the locational signal, or whatever we want to call it, from the plan? Do we need both? How do they intersect? How do they work together?
Yeah, you see, we are asking exactly the same
Okay,
question,
good.
normally. So the question is, once you have a spatial plan and there
Yeah,
has a broad location of objects in it, even if
yeah,
there's sort of regional aggregated targets, then how do you enact the plan? And you
yeah,
can enact that plan through a variety of non-price locational signals like
yeah.
connection policies, planning policies, seabed leasing policies. And you can also use price signals like the network charges. And I think the one main thing that we are very clear with government on is that Ofgem shouldn't go off in isolation and design the network charges without considering how the non-price locational levers are being used. So I think we need to just look across the span of technologies,
Hmm.
maybe even go technology by technology and say, how are these non-price locational levers working first? So how much freedom do they create in terms of
Yeah,
locational decisions? And obviously, where there is a considerable amount of freedom for the market to choose location, then there is a sense in sending price signals so that they're fed into the auctions and you get efficient
yeah.
results from the auctions. But where there isn't really a much of a choice on location because the non-price locational levers are essentially constraining that choice, then, like you say, it's harder to see what the point is of sending very sharp, price signals to those types of projects. So I think we need to do some early work with the government and the NISO to look across the span of technologies at the locational levers, both on the price and the non-price side. Hopefully that will be done in the next few months so that when we engage in earnest early next year on the transmission charging reform, that's very well informed by and fully supported by a strategy for locational levers in the round. So everybody understands what role the network charges have to play, and then we design them to play that role. I
Okay.
have to say that probably, again, as we said in the open letter, our instinct is that there may likely be a difference in potential of between the generation projects where the spatial plan is being quite directive
Yeah.
versus demand and storage, and certainly demand. I think there may be a much stronger case there because it's
Okay.
harder, I think, to plan demand in quite the same way. Not impossible, and of course we'll
Hmm.
come back to demand in a second, but we did say in the open letter that we wanted to think not just about locational signals to generation, but importantly, locational signals to storage and to demand.
Okay. Just to pick up on the storage point specifically, one of the questions actually I think we had in beforehand was around the LDES process is going on at the moment, long duration storage, and at the moment, we're not. I think you signalled to NUOS by outcomes at sort of 2029. Is that right? Or so at the moment, storage is treated as generation essentially in fundamental legal terms. So that will have quite a strong signal, I guess, potentially dampening down long duration storage in Scotland, which may or might make sense locationally in terms of constraints, etc. Is there a bit of a mismatch there between the kind of some of the processes there? We're trying to bring forward long duration to NUOS. The signal from to NUOS we want to send it isn't quite aligned with that.
I think there could be. I don't know for sure. We're just going through the LDES assessment at the moment. But certainly one big part of that LDES assessment is to assess the system benefits of the projects, including their locational value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where we feel like those are, meaningful and credible for consumers, then we want to make sure that we support projects to locate. Then you can see a clear case really for a lot of long duration storage in Scotland, where you can soak up the excess renewable energy. And as you say, I mean, I think that's just a reflection of this period that we're in, where the network charges are still working on the old system, where they look at the network as it is and they send signals using the transport model that we have at the moment, and they don't necessarily align to what the system is planning and what the system needs. So I think there will be a little bit of an uncomfortable transition as we go through it. For LDES, we'll obviously make sure that we assess the locational value and the system benefits properly when we're supporting projects. And then the other side of 2030, once the new system is in, it should fully reflect the spatial plan.
Okay, and just finally on Teneos, the mix of locational signal and operational signals, is it something that could be used to send? Got a question here. Could it only long run signal? Could it help optimize network optimization and constraint management through kind of operational
At this
element?
stage, we're largely looking at it as an investment signal. And I think we'll be looking at the operational bits in the third leg, in terms of balancing market reforms.
Okay.
But I'm not close to the idea of, we used to have, triads was an example. I was half joking earlier, but triads was an example of using transmission charges to send operational signals to people. It can be done, but I think there may be better, more effective ways of doing it through the balancing mechanism.
Okay, that's clear. Let's then move on to that third leg of constraint costs and managing those. We've been looking at that and trying to understand what's actually driving those costs. And obviously, the long-term solution is building more network, but that will take time, and costs are a very important and sensitive issue at the moment. Any particular key areas you want to kind of highlight that you're focusing on? You talked about the balancing mechanism, making that work better. What kind of reforms do you have in mind there?
Yes, I think we've already got a program up and running with the NESO to look at how you improve competition in the balancing market itself. So, at the moment, the dominant technologies are, if you have a problem on constraints, you switch off the wind farm and you turn up the gas plant. And over time, we'd like there to be more alternatives. So, to consider things like demand turn up in Scotland as an alternative to curtailment, and to consider demand flexibility, batteries in particular, as alternatives to curtailment or turning up the gas plant in the south. We also want to take a look at interconnectors and whether they can play a bigger role in balancing. I think that is quite difficult at the moment under the existing rules post-Brexit, but we definitely want to explore, as part of the government's dialogue with the European Commission on the EU Reset dialogue, whether there is a way of creating a more effective way for the NESO to utilize interconnectors in balancing. And Merlin, you'll remember, one of the biggest parts of the benefits case for zonal pricing came from the better use of interconnectors. So I think there is quite a lot of value there on the table. If we can do that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's something we definitely agree. I seem to remember reading about 5 or 6 years ago, writing a paper in praise of interconnection, and there definitely do seem to be some interesting models in Europe of better system operator trading and the like. But obviously, the post-Brexit trading arrangements provide some complexity to that. So good to hear you're looking at that, and it's definitely a key area. One of the things that we've noticed when we've started to sort of try and pull it apart in the data, which isn't perhaps quite as easy and transparent as it might as to what actually drives constraints, is that outages on the network, that the level of capacity on the network. I think some of the boundaries in B4 and B6 have been operating at
B4, B6 in particular, I think
quite low percentage of their overall for quite long periods, and it's difficult to figure out exactly how much of the cost is down to outages rather than sort of nameplate capacity. But it does feel like it does look like it's quite significant, and there isn't a lot of transparency about why outages are taken, for how long. Is there any way that they could be taken at different times or for shorter times or more efficient? Is that an area Ofgem is? I mean, obviously that's a NESO responsibility.
No, I'm glad you mentioned it. It's very much an area we've created an incentive across the NESO and the TOs to optimize outages and to drive down constraint costs using better outage management. And again, we'll be amplifying that investment in the T3 period. I mean, how much of a financial difference that will make, I think, remains to be seen. But there is definitely a lot of value there for consumers if we can optimize outages. And historically, the networks haven't been incentivized to think about outage planning from a constraints management perspective. So I think this is definitely a big thing in the incentive design in T3 that's coming up. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'd asked you to also have a chat with Steve, is because we want to make sure that we are essentially utilizing all the ideas out there in terms of what the networks can do to
Yep.
contribute to better constraints management. The other thing that they can do, obviously, is to release the network capacity using better technology like dynamic line rating and so on. And again, we're going to be incentivizing them to do that in T3 on a much bigger scale.
Okay, there's a question from one Johnny Gowdy. Not sure who he is, in the chat about the whether there's enough grip on the understanding of what those constraint drivers are, the solid forecasts of how much they'll change, and could we have some kind of task force really zeroing in on this? I mean, that 8 billion figure that's floated around, I'm not sure has a lot of. It doesn't look very solid when we look at the numbers, but it's sort of got a bit of traction. So is there just more focus and more grip on that issue?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think constraint costs are going to be one of the defining issues of this Clean Power 2030 transition. I mean, if we end up with 8-10 billion pounds a year constraint costs, that is going to be very visible. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult to explain to the public why we are, setting up a lot of these wind farms and then paying them to turn off a good chunk of the time. So I think it is. I think it's existential to the clean power effort that we solve this problem. And as you say, the long-term answer is very clear. You solve this problem by properly coordinating transmission and generation, getting the network built. But we do have a very specific problem in the lead up to 2030, where we need to use every lever that we've got, Merlin, whether it's on the network side or the system operator side, or the demand side, every lever that we've got to try and keep handle. And I take the point on transparency. And again, that's something I'm happy to take back into Ofgem and to the NESO to say, can we get a bit more public transparency on the forecasting of these constraint costs so that people can contribute their ideas with better information?
Okay, excellent. And just on the balancing side, you've mentioned potential reforms of the balancing mechanism, opening up the market, more competition, etc. And it wouldn't be a discussion about markets and balancing without mentioning skip rates, which is a favourite term we've all got to know about. So that is, I think, an example where NESO has, we work with them on a chief execs forum. They've and I think Ofgem is putting quite a lot of kind of focus on that in your side of things, and we're starting to see improvements, but still, it's interesting how much of a challenge it is to kind of get these kind of reforms through. So for those who have managed to save themselves knowing about skip rates as far, essentially we're saying it's when in the balancing mechanism you skip the NESO rather than choosing the cheapest asset to help balance the system, chooses another more expensive asset. So which generally means a gas-fired power station instead of a battery in current circumstances. So I just wonder if you kind of reflect on that issue and why that's proved to a difficult issue to kind of, because it should be driving down costs and carbon, but it's been pretty hard to make progress on.
Yeah, I agree. And I think progress is being made now. So as you say, I think NESO has really gripped it. They have a lot of focus. We are pushing them a lot. We have a lot of focus on the skip rates. And we want to sort of drive those down as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible, because we want the system to be balanced at least cost. I mean, in terms of why it has been a difficult issue, I mean, I think it's probably a combination of, cultural factors, a kind of a comfort with what is familiar. So gas plants are familiar. People are used to doing business with them. They're quite reliable. When you need them, they turn up, turn down, etc. Which I think is changing, because that the batteries are becoming a more mainstream technology in balancing now. And then there was a sort of more prosaic technical issues about the visibility that the control room has about the state of the batteries, their charge and discharge status, which then enters into how much confidence they can have that if they pick the battery, it will definitely deliver. And obviously our control room staff, by the way, I should just a shout out to them. They do an absolutely magnificent job. And this is one of the hardest jobs in the country to do. They're largely unsung, uncelebrated. But on occasions like this, I think it is worth just recognizing what a difficult job that is, even if you did not have this problem of congestion, which has been created by the lack of coordination between generation and transmission. Even the system just as it is to balance it and keep the frequency and the voltage and the current in the right place is a tremendously difficult job. And I think they do it brilliantly well. But giving them access and really confident access to these new technologies, whether it's batteries I think are the first frontier,
Yeah.
and then demand flexibility I think is the next frontier.
Okay.
So that we are using the gas plants as little as possible. If they're more expensive than these alternatives, then we should use the cheaper alternatives. Absolutely.
Do you envisage a world where we're shortening the balancing period? The market's doing more 15-minute balancing periods, 5 minutes, up to, do you
I
see
think
that?
that is in the scope. That is in the scope of the RNP program.
Yeah.
I don't have any particular insight as to
Okay.
how likely that is, but it's definitely in scope.
I suppose in terms of thinking of market fundamentals, you're trying to get as much competition. You've been pointing to that with batteries, with demand side response. You're trying to get as liquid markets as possible, transparency, and as close to real time decision making as possible if you want to kind of minimize market inefficiency. So
yeah, agreed.
Okay, let's just. I wanted to talk about local, as you know. I always like to bring that up, and we've got lots of questions as well from our delegates. So I guess the government has committed to 8 gigawatts of local power, so it's a manifesto commitment, and they're working on a local power plan. I'm sure you guys are a part of that. And I think you can see the political kind of reasons behind that. I think that you could see that local, and it's something Regen has been strongly involved in and believes in, that local places are able to own their own generation, or they have part of local energy schemes, etc. Have a chance to benefit directly, to participate in, to feel part of a transition rather than feeling something just done on them to them. They can actually feel the benefits, etc. I wonder how Ofgem kind of, those are values that perhaps don't come out of a cost-benefit analysis, but they're pretty obvious to us all, I guess, looking at the politics. And I wonder whether Ofgem has sort of worked out how to sort of integrate that into its thinking. And I guess to sort of challenge you a little bit on that, looking at the sector-specific methodology consultation yesterday, I did a search for local power and found 0 hits on that. I think there were 3 on local energy systems, 244 on connections, by the way. So is enabling that kind of more bottom-up local engagement as the energy something that Ofgem has figured out how to value in the way it manages the regulation of the system?
So I think the short answer is not entirely. I think it's a difficult thing to value because at the highest level, when we think about competition between technologies, our approach is to focus on keeping the price of electricity down. Because I think we think that is the biggest contribution that we can make to economic growth in this country, is to keep a lid on electricity prices. And so one should generally choose and give access to cheaper technologies over more expensive technologies. And market competition in the market essentially determines that. But I think what we see with the local power situation, particularly community energy projects, is that they can be quite cost effective, but they are small scale, and they struggle because they are small scale. They find it difficult to navigate the system. So there is essentially a navigational support that has to be provided to a lot of people like local authorities, municipals are doing municipal energy and so on, or even small community groups. The energy system can be a very complicated place for them to navigate. And I do think that GB Energy has a very important role to play in this respect. Government is obviously funding them to play a key role in this space, and I look forward to that. I think Dan definitely has this on his agenda. But then even if you solve that kind of informational navigational problem, there are some sort of basic issues in terms of access to the market, and then how the costs are distributed for what kind of costs they're asked to pay in respect of community energy projects versus being socialized to everybody else, that I think we need to just pay some attention to. I mean, there is a code mod at the moment going through 441, which is looking at essentially creating a class of sites where you aggregate local demand and supply together, and then that acts like a net,
Hmm.
like a net meter, like a net metering arrangement.
Hmm.
And so, to the extent that you have costs that are based on net metering arrangement, they'll pay therefore a lower cost because you will balance or
Yep.
set off export and import and only charge for the net out of that aggregated community. So we're going to look at that, but I think the question there is, if the costs that you're talking about here, the system costs, particularly things like network charges, are essentially unavoidable, then if they are not paid by the community energy projects, then they will be paid by somebody else. They will just be put on other consumers. And there the question then is there a sufficiently clear system benefit from the community energy scheme that is offering some value to justify the shifting of that cost from them to someone else? And that's,
Hmm.
I think that's the sort of question we're going to look at in the context of
Okay.
B4.
Okay. I think that's a good comprehensive answer. Just to put it from the sort of perspective of somebody out, the sort of somebody out there slogging away, trying to do something in their community. They think they're doing the right thing. It's a government manifesto commitment. It's about helping people in their community to benefit and be part of the transition. They perhaps come up with a generation scheme, and the first obvious thing for them to do is to supply that power back to people
Right.
in their community. It's a fairly obvious, a thing to do, and then people can benefit directly, etc. When they at the moment, if they supplied that power through a private wire direct to their next door neighbor, so to
Yeah.
speak, they would pay nothing towards the network.
Correct.
If they sold all of it to that person next to them, but they touched the public network, then they
Yeah.
pay everything, and there's no
Yeah.
recognition of any avoiding losses, avoiding
Yeah.
constraints,
Yeah.
anything in that. And you wonder
Yeah.
whether it feels a slightly odd. You wonder whether there should be some. I don't think anybody is arguing that they shouldn't. That we all need the network and need to pay towards the network. But it feels like there should be some ability there to kind of recognise that kind of local supply benefit, whether that's the social benefit or some recognition that there must be some network benefit from trying to balance locally to some extent.
Yeah, and I think that's the heart of the question, isn't it? So I think if the argument is that local supply essentially avoids network investment, then there must be some value that can be attributed to it.
Yeah.
And so some degree of exemption or discount makes sense. It could be given in that respect. But if the local supply doesn't avoid the network investment, so your fixed costs are exactly the same, all you're doing is shifting them from one class of consumers to another class of consumers,
Mm-hmm.
then I think it's a less obvious answer in that respect. And I think it will come down to this basic thing: that does local supply and local balancing essentially
Yeah.
conserve or reduce system costs? I think that's the question we're going to be grappling with.
Okay, so as you say, you've drawn a distinction between, is there an actual clear value stream in the way that we consider the way we design networks, and that's kind of one issue. And then on the other side, there clearly is a social value, and I guess government has accepted that in deciding to come up with a local power plan and setting a target. I'm just noticing in the question, someone's suggesting my question was presenting local energy as a touchy-feely woke thing rather than a core part of the energy system. So if I came across as that, that's definitely not my intention as someone who's been a long-term supporter of this agenda. So if we put aside the network benefits and just say, look, there is a social, so the government has accepted there's a social benefit to this and it's important. How does Ofgem facilitate people to deliver these schemes and achieve those benefits? How would you see that? Or is that not Ofgem's role? That's for government to recognise the social value.
Yes, I think in the context of social value is to provide subsidy, then I think that would more legitimately be placed in the government space,
Okay.
Because I think the government quite rightly makes tax and spend decisions based on things like social value. I think for us, the question is much more to do with system system
Okay.
benefits. So I think there are
Okay.
system benefits to all consumers.
Mhm.
Then it does make sense to change the charging arrangements to
Yeah.
reflect those system benefits. If it's just a transfer from one set of
Okay.
consumers to another, then I think we need to think a little harder about that.
Okay, so that's I think helpful for everyone in this space to understand that if they're kind of working with Ofgem, it's really about, are they demonstrating the system benefits of doing which instinctively one thinks there is. If you can balance supply and demand at a local level better, then there should be some reduction in costs somewhere in the system at some point. And then, but if we're talking about the social value, etc., that is more of a public policy government thing for us. So that I think is helpful. Okay. If you're happy at this stage, actually, I think we might just take the last sort of 15 minutes or 10, 15 minutes, just open it up to the
Yes, of course,
to the field, to our participants. So if anyone would like to ask a question, then please do put it in. I've got quite a lot here, and you've all been upvoting. So these might take us back to some of the topics we've already discussed to some degree, okay, but maybe that I think that may still be useful. So you won't be surprised. The first one is about connections reform. Tom Kenyon Brown, why after I'm allowing NESO to underform, not consult about key parts connections reform? NESO going to stop and slow down delivery of projects in 2026, 28. They could simply focus on those projects now, create that baseline this year. So there's still, so yes, that's the most uprated and voted question on from our audience. Covered this in some depth.
we
Is there
did.
anything you want to add?
So I'm just wondering whether that's getting to. So I think there is a kind of sequencing and prioritization of the near-term projects over the long-term, medium to long-term projects. But I think this question is getting to, can we do even more? So rather than just focusing on the 26, 27 ones, can we look at 27, 28 as well? Is that your reading as well, Merlin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is just, it's essentially reiterating this context, the concern about near-term projects and the fact that we are slowing down development, and then you risk pushing everything back, and you end up with a sort of bow wave of trying to do more and more in less and less time.
I mean, Tom, the only thing I can say to you is just be assured that from Ofgem's perspective, we want the near-term to medium-term projects out there as quickly as possible. So we definitely want to prioritize them. I know NESO colleagues are also going to try and parallel process and accelerate as much as they can. And we want to get those connection offers out as quickly as we can. And then we want to get to the first enduring window in 2026 as quickly as we possibly can. But I would just ask for a little bit of patience. I know that there's a lot of frustration in the industry, but just keep the faith. Let's just keep working together, because we just have to do this once, get it right, and once we get to the other side, we will just have a much, much better process.
Okay. And one other more specific point on the connections reform thing that I know a lot of people have come up with is the is that projects which have applied for planning but not got it in time to be protected under the gate 2 to whole queue exercise, but they will be protected if they then go into the next window. Does that make sense? So they've got planning permission not by the end of the first window, but after that.
So sometime during 2025, they've got that planning.
Well, I had a project. I didn't manage to get planning before the end of the window, so I'm not protected in the gate 2 exercise, but I've been in the planning system. I do get my planning then, let's say in August or September time. I now, the methodology was I would go into the next window.
Yeah.
And in that window, I would be protected against the strategic alignment criteria. There's quite a number of people asking, well, given we've got this delay in the process, couldn't we then, these projects have now, say, got planning. There's about maybe, I think, 40 or 50 of them out there when someone showed me some numbers. Couldn't we integrate those into this process rather than making them wait for the now delayed next window?
It's a good thought. I mean, let me take that back and discuss it with NESO colleagues. I think if it can be done without slowing things down, then I think we should definitely look at it. If it has the effect of having to change methodologies or reconcile and slow things down, then I think we should probably just stick to what we've got and get through it as soon as we can.
Great. Okay. I think that's probably picked up on most of the questions are around connections reform and local energy issues. There's a particular question, maybe just to leave on your register, that UK power networks have published their connections queue for demand projects, interestingly, and will Ofgem make that a requirement across DNOs as a particular suggestion?
To publish, just say that again?
The connection queue for demand projects. I think one of the issues that I'm sure you're aware of coming up with the question of data centers and the like is are we going to hit sort of equal problems for demand connections as we have on generation side? So maybe a comment on thinking on that, and then there's a particular suggestion there that just as we publish generation queues, could we publish demand queues?
Yes. I'm glad that came up. So thank you to whoever asked the question. I think the demand queue is the next frontier of connections reform, as I was saying earlier in our conversation. And we're starting to see similar patterns emerge there in terms of the very rapid growth in that demand queue over the last year. Now, some of that will be real projects, ready projects that are necessary for economic growth in the country. Some of that might be more speculative. And I think we'd want to just work through the readiness criteria and the financial commitments with those projects to get to a credible queue. And then there's a lot of work now going on across Ofgem, DESNES and NESO to think about how we manage the growth in demand and get them their connection offers as quickly as possible. Which could range from giving people more flexible connections if they want to connect early, but are willing to accept a degree of curtailment risk. We want to look at self-build and whether that could make a difference in this space if that helps to accelerate some types of connections. And we definitely want to look at how capacity reservation works and whether some of these projects can be given a degree of priority if they are really, really important. Now, already there's a scope for the system operator to designate projects that produce a particular system value. And we want to see if we can build on that. But more generally, I think we want to see if there is a way of creating some prioritization procedure for them. That's the sort of short-term piece of work. I think in the medium to long term, we definitely see some value in the spatial energy plan, looking at least major classes of demand on a more strategic basis so that we can work out where these major demand centers should go, and then planning the network in anticipation for both the demand and the supply side. So again, well, in medium to long-term solution, I think definitely lies in that spatial planning, anticipatory network investment space. But in the short term, we're going to have to manage our way through what is quite a significant and rapidly growing demand queue.
So in strategically planning, would you see a world where we might say data centers are strategically aligned or not strategically aligned? We may prioritize. I mean, that would obviously be quite a strong, quite an economically significant potential decision, I guess.
I think it's more to do with. So at the moment, there's no needs filter for demand. We deem all demand projects as needed. I think it's more trying to plan them in terms of what kind of demand capacity do we project in each of the different regions across the country, and then building the network in anticipation of that, and then sending them the right kind of signals through things like network charges so that the demand locates in helpful ways and isn't unnecessarily impeded because the grid is not ready for them. And I think that is going to take a little bit of work because obviously the first generation won't be perfect of the SSEP in this respect. But as time goes on, I very much hope we can get a lot better at strategically planning the major classes of demand as well.
Okay, that's helpful. It's worth saying in the because I think TRESP does not actually cover really demand that stuff at all. It is something that we do when we work with the networks on distribution future energy scenarios. We do look at industrial and commercial demand to some extent, at least, and data centers. So, and at least some of the networks we're working with have started to put quite a lot of thought into engaging with their customers to try and understand those pipelines. Great. Okay, actually, I think we're coming up towards time. I wanted to flash up a couple of messages about forthcoming events and membership and the like for Regen. But I think from at this point, let me just thank you so much for taking such a wide-ranging set of questions, and I hope I wasn't I didn't have too much my Nick Robinson kind of interview style.
No, thank you. Thank you, Merlin. Thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for coming along. I think this is a ongoing conversation. There's a huge amount of collaboration needed across the industry to get everything done for Clean Power 2030. But as I said at the beginning, there's never been a better time to work in this space. So I'm really looking forward to it. So
great to finish our discussion on a positive note. And I think, it's from my point of view, it's sort of it's a little bit of a complex space for us all psychologically, if you like, in a way, and that we're go for CP30. We're desperately trying, get as much as we can, put to the pedal, reform, and then there's quite a complex political space around it as well. But I think for me, it's about focusing on delivery. The more we deliver, the more we show that this can work. The more certain it becomes, the more embedded it becomes. So that's certainly where Regen's very much focused. So thank you once again, Akshay. I'm just going to hand over to Hannah briefly to give a few messages around other things coming up. Do you want to talk to it, Hannah, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to it. Thank you both very, very much for your insightful discussion. So yeah, I'm here at the end just to say thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Many of you already are members of ours. But for those of you that aren't, I was going to do like a very, very quick update on the things and the areas that we're focusing on and what we're really doing. So it'd be brilliant if you were interested in joining us on Grid. As Akshay mentioned, we've been working very, very closely with NESO throughout the Grid Connections process, particularly with our Grid working group being very active throughout. And Merlin also is chairing the NESO's CPAG and is also on the Connections Delivery Board, and we're very active with the other trade associations. And then markets, obviously, Johnny was we've been very strong vision for reform at the very beginning. And since the move away from zonal pricing, we've been focusing on supporting REMA with their national pricing plan, which obviously we've spoken about today. Planning, obviously, we've been engaging with the SSEP and the REST processes. Also on the ground as well, advocating strongly for better resourcing for local planning authorities for number 10. And my colleague Rebecca Windermere has been really sort of driving that change. And then finally, on sort of like our people side of things, our Just Transition stream is developing swiftly. We now sit on a number of key working groups for that. And this is all stuff that we work very, very closely with our members on. Without our members, we wouldn't have the voice and we wouldn't have the strive and the drive to be able to support this change to CP30. So we really do work alongside you guys. So if you are interested in joining us as members, then do just let me know. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about it. And then quickly on to some other upcoming events as well. So many of you will know that we've got our Electricity Storage Networks annual conference coming up in November, and we've got keynote speaker of Michael Shanks who's going to be joining us. I will send out joining links for all of these and a way to book online for these in-person events as well. So that's happening in London. And then one's for your diary for next year as well. So we have the Regen Planning Conference. It's the first time we're running this conference. It's going to be happening in late January. Again, being focused on planning. It'll have elements of SSEP, RESP, and some of the other work that I mentioned earlier. And then the day afterwards, because we are a sucker for punishment, we are also hosting our inaugural Rewire Summit, which will be supporting and developing our Regen's Entrepreneurial Women in Renewable Energy initiative. So lots of exciting things coming up for your diaries. But yeah, I will hand back to Merlin, but thank you again both for your inspiring discussion today.
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you for Hannah was the power behind the throne there and running the system, making sure it all worked, telling me when I was forgetting to ask the right questions, obviously.
Very important.
Let's draw it to a close there. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I think we managed to keep a pretty high level of attendance right the way through, Akshay. So even despite the depth of what we were discussing, so that's always an encouraging sign. They weren't turning off in their droves.
Very good.
But thanks again for your time, and as you say, an ongoing conversation we look forward to continuing with you.
Thanks very much, Merlin.
Thanks all. Bye.